Olaus Rudbeck was a Swedish scientist, inventor and writer, and professor of medicine at Uppsala University in the 17th century. He is famous as being one of the first to discover the form and function of the lymphatic system, a network of tissues and organs that help rid the human body of toxins, waste and other unwanted material. But he is also known for his magnum opus, the 3,000-page treatise in 4 volumes called Atlantica. In this work, he set out to prove that Sweden was in fact Plato's Atlantis, the cradle of civilization, and that Swedish was the original language of Adam from which Latin and Hebrew had evolved. Is there any truth to this controversial belief in a Scandinavian Atlantis? In the old town of Uppsala, located just north of the new, a little old parish church stands on the site of a former pagan temple, and this pagan temple stood on the site of what was once the principal temple of the capital of Plato's Atlantis. In other words, Uppsala was once the capital of Atlantis, and Sweden was once the lost continent of Atlantis. Such at least was the contention of the polymath Swedish genius Olaus Rudbeck, who lived mostly in Uppsala from 1630 to 1702, and who was, with Thomas Bartholin working independently, the co-discoverer of the lymphatic system, accomplishing this feat at the age of 22. Rudbeck's second most enduring achievement was his monumental 4-volume, almost magnum opus, Atlantica, first published in a bilingual Latin-Swedish edition between the years 1679 and 1702, the volumes appearing almost a decade apart, and presenting 104 reasons why present-day Sweden must have been ancient Atlantis. Rudbeck was a prodigious figure. A professor of medicine at Uppsala University, he was a great anatomist and botanist, familiar with astronomy, and an able musician, architect and master builder who was at home in every branch of technology. He built a shipyard and, in it, 3 yachts, which he used to run a weekly mail service between Uppsala and Stockholm. He undertook to produce a life-size woodcut of every plant known to science, ending up with 7,000 wood forms, 1,200 reproduced, the rest perishing in the fire that ravaged Uppsala in 1702. Rudbeck financed and led into the dangerous and mountainous wilds of Lapland north of the Arctic Circle. The first fully equipped scientific expedition, bringing back numerous specimens of plants and even animals not previously known to science. He was an honorary member of the Royal Society of London, though he never attended a meeting. In 1720, Isaac Newton wrote a letter to a prominent French philosopher begging for a copy of Atlantica, which he very likely received and read, since it contained comparative chronologies of the gods of antiquity similar to those of Newton. For good measure, Rudbeck was the great-great-grandfather of Alfred Nobel, the Swedish chemist industrialist who invented dynamite and used the profits to establish the Nobel Prize. While Rudbeck's central thesis, that Sweden was Atlantis, sounds preposterous, for all those seriously interested in learning more about what Atlantica offers in its superabundance of material, multiple clues to the whereabouts of Atlantis pointing in other directions than Sweden. Like most natural philosophers of his day, the Swedish savant believed the Bible was factual and that the story of Noah was true in every detail. So Rudbeck framed his great work with an account of how the descendants of the sons of Noah were dispersed throughout the world beginning 100 years after the flood, which event 17th century chronology placed at 2400 BC. Estimating with very fancy arithmetic that the world's population in 2300 BC was 10,000 couples, Rudbeck zeroes in on the tribe of Magog, synonymous with Goth, the son of Japhet, one of the 3 sons of Noah. The author maintains that this tribe journeyed far north to cross the Black Sea, then followed the Russian rivers to the Kymi districts in northern Finland, after which it immigrated to the plain around Uppsala in the middle of what would become Sweden. Why did the tribe of Magog go so far? Rudbeck contends that Noah and the first generations of his descendants, in separating out into tribes, were obliged to settle on the shores of seas. This was because water being the natural element of fish, all the fish had survived the flood, so the original survivors of the flood hastened to the coastal areas to be assured of the plentiful supply of pre-diluvian food that was swimming in the waters offshore. The Greeks and Egyptians settled around the Mediterranean, the Chaldeans by the Persian Gulf, and the Chinese near the Indian Ocean. The tribe of Magog had struck out far to the north, eventually settling in the coastal areas around the Baltic and the North Sea. Rudbeck next sets out to prove that Sweden had been inhabited from the earliest possible times. He accomplishes this by at first showing that the Swedes, using beyond the Arctic Circle astronomical cues, began to reckon time far, far earlier than originally had been supposed. He then demonstrates that the disposition of black humus on the ground and on many ancient monuments in Sweden argues for a far greater antiquity than had been thought. He winds up his major arguments by pointing out that a great many ancient Swedish names, especially place names, have hitherto unsuspected links with their counterparts in Atlantis. For example, the Greek word Nessos means not only island but also peninsula, as in, for example, Peloponnesus. So why shouldn't the word Nessos in Plato refer to the Scandinavian peninsula? Rudbeck then lays out a list of no fewer than 102 circumstances that link Scandinavia, and thus Sweden, to the Atlantis of Plato. In particular, he points to the waterways that, according to Plato, surrounded Atlantis, and which, since Plato calls them channels, seem to refer to artificial constructs. Using a method of interpretation he often uses in the book, Rudbeck argues that Plato is speaking literally, not figuratively, and that he is actually referring to the natural waterways that separate the vast archipelagos, surrounding most of the Swedish and Scandinavian coasts. Rudbeck goes on to describe many similarities between Old Uppsala and Atlantis' capital as described by Plato. Both lie in the middle of a large plain and are about the same distance from the north and south ends of the country, and there are correspondences between the positions of the buildings, the channels, and the ports of each. In all, Rudbeck finds 44 substantial places of evidence to back up his topographical argument for the identification of Sweden Uppsala with Atlantis. Next, the author weighs in with 58 pieces of historical evidence linking Atlantis and Sweden. Chief among them is his reconstruction of the roster of the ancient kings of Atlantis, in whose names he finds an astonishing number of etymological similarities. Here, Rudbeck identifies the site of the parish church of the old town of Uppsala with the main temple of the capital of Atlantis, its foremost building according to Plato. The most glaring contradiction between Rudbeck's thesis and Plato's account is, of course, the high and dry nature of Sweden today, as opposed to Plato's assertion that ancient Atlantis sank beneath the waves. Of greater importance was the following passage in Plato, duly cited by Rudbeck. But at a later time there occurred portentous earthquakes and floods, and one grievous day and night befell them, when the whole body of your warriors was swallowed up by the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner was swallowed up by the sea and vanished. Wherefore also the ocean of that spot has now become impassable and unsearchable, being blocked up by the shoal mud which the island created as it settled down. Rudbeck declared the literal meaning of this passage to be unreasonable, both according to the Holy Bible, which assured us that only one universal flood had visited our earth, and because of the 102 circumstances that were evidence that Atlantis still existed. So Plato must have spoken figuratively, meaning devastating conquests and robberies that troubled the communication between Sweden and Greece. In all of the above, we've only touched at the tip of the iceberg of all Rudbeck had to say about Sweden and Atlantis. Harnessing torrents of learning, the author also argued that the ancient Swedish language influenced all other classical languages and all other classical myths as well. Then there is his scintillating, many-layered explanation of why the legendary Hyperboreans must have been the Swedes of the ancient past, and his series of proofs that the scientific discoveries of the modern world were known to the ancients, for example Pythagoras as part of the primal wisdom, and that they were also known to the Swedes of antiquity.
The magical lost land of Atlantis has captured the imagination of poets, scholars, archaeologists, geologists, occultists, and travelers for more than 2,000 years. The notion of a highly civilized, advanced island civilization which flourished in remote antiquity only to be destroyed overnight by a huge natural catastrophe has inspired believers in the historical truth of the Atlantis tale to search practically every corner of the earth for remnants of this once great civilization. Lately, searchers have been concentrating on the Mediterranean and have turned up some interesting results off Cyprus, on the Greek mainland near Corinth, and on the islands of Santorini and Sardinia. For many archaeologists, however, the Atlantis story is just that, a story, an allegorical tale with little, if any, historical value. Others have approached the story of Atlantis from the standpoint that it represents either a lost spiritual homeland, like Mu or Lemuria, or a different plane of existence entirely. In one or two theories, the mysterious Nephilim have been connected with an advanced pre-Diluvian civilization thought by some to be Atlantis. What is it about Atlantis that can have inspired such diverse interpretations, and could there be any truth behind the story? In November 2004, newspapers around the world carried the story that an Iranian-American architect named Robert Sarmast had located Atlantis off Cyprus after 10 years of research using ocean mapping technology and accounts from ancient texts. Sarmast said at the time, "This is going to rewrite the history books. We are set to make the biggest archaeological discovery of all time." He claimed that around 9000 BC the Mediterranean basin was flooded in a deluge that submerged a rectangular man-made site which he believed was Atlantis. The lost civilization apparently lay around 5,000 feet below sea level, 50 miles or so off the southeastern coast of Cyprus. Sarmast and his team had carried out deep-water sonar scanning which indicated man-made structures on a submerged hill, including a wall almost 3 miles long, a walled hill summit, and deep trenches. According to Sarmast, "It's a miracle we found these walls, as their location and lengths match exactly the description of the Acropolis of Atlantis provided by Plato in his writings. We cannot yet provide tangible proof in the form of bricks and mortar, as the artifacts are still buried under several meters of sediment, but the circumstantial and other evidence is irrefutable. My discovery will vindicate Plato. Within his dialogues, Plato provides factual clues as to what Atlantis was like. I've matched all but 2 of the 45 clues within the area around Cyprus. That's either the biggest coincidence in the history of the world, or we've found Plato's Atlantis." Plato's account is so detailed that it's possible to make city plans based on his description. These match exactly the antediluvian maps of Cyprus as discovered through oceanographic mapping. Unfortunately, Sarmast didn't produce any evidence to support his theory at the time, so understandably he wasn't taken seriously. He returned to Cyprus in June 2011 to film a documentary in support of his Atlantis theory, again with the backing of the Cyprus Tourism Organization, as well as the History Channel, together with a number of private investors. However, Sarmast appears to have made no further discoveries near Cyprus, and there have been no updates on his work on his website or anywhere else for many years. Recently, Italian writer and journalist Sergio Frau, one of the founders of Italian daily La Repubblica, put forward the theory that Sardinia might be Plato's island of Atlantis. The Greek philosopher placed the lost continent beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which Frau believes was not the Strait of Gibraltar, but the strait between Sicily and Tunisia. It's known that around 1175 BC, a terrible catastrophe plunged Sardinia into a dark age. There are certainly some similarities between Plato's account of Atlantis and the island of Sardinia. Plato says Atlantis was inhabited by elephants. Incredibly, fossil remains of dwarf elements have been found on Sardinia. Atlantis had mountains in the north and along the coast, with a flat plain in the south. This description fits the landscape of Sardinia very closely. The people of Atlantis' religious practices included the sacrificing of bulls. Symbols of bull horns can be found all over Sardinia, carved into tombs and caves. Although Sardinia is perhaps an overlooked candidate for ancient Atlantis, the evidence discovered so far is promising. However, future research will turn up more vital clues. The southernmost of the Cyclades group of islands, Santorini, is a small circular archipelago of rocky volcanic islands in the southern Aegean Sea. The largest of the Santorini group is the modern island of Santorini, once known as Thera, where at the height of the Greek Bronze Age, about 2000 to 1650 BC, a thriving Minoan community inhabited the town of Akrotiri. The Minoans were an advanced Bronze Age civilization which arose on the island of Crete and flourished from approximately 2700 to 1450 BC. The volcanic eruption on Thera variously dated from the mid-1700s BC to the mid-1600s BC, split the island in two, and buried and preserved Akrotiri much in the same way as centuries later Vesuvius buried Pompeii. The eruption was one of the biggest in the past 10,000 years and has a rating of 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. The catastrophe would have affected civilization in the eastern Mediterranean for hundreds of years after it occurred, and it's been suggested on more than one occasion that the devastating eruption caused the collapse of the Minoan civilization and was the inspiration for Plato's myth of Atlantis. The original excavator of Akrotiri, Spiridon Marinatros, believed that Plato's story of an intellectually and technologically advanced civilization suddenly destroyed by a catastrophic event was based on the collapse of the Minoans. However, the main objection to this theory is that Plato states clearly that Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules. In the summer of 426 BC, one of the most disastrous earthquakes in ancient history hit Greece north of Athens. The tsunami from this colossal quake caused havoc along the coast north of Athens, destroying part of an island called Atlantis. In 373 BC, only around 15 years before Plato wrote his dialogues, a catastrophic earthquake and tsunami destroyed and submerged the wealthy ancient Greek city of Helike on the southern shores of the Gulf of Corinth on mainland Greece. Helike was known as the city of Poseidon and contained a sacred grove of the terrible god of earthquakes and the sea, which was second only to that at Delphi. There are certainly parallels between these classical earthquakes and the destruction of Plato's Atlantis, which indicate the philosopher was drawing on his own country's recent history for much of his narrative. However, if Plato was simply using recent disasters in Greece to make his point, why did he attribute his story to Egyptian priests? Surely his contemporaries would have recognized a description of a catastrophic earthquake in the area of Athens or Corinth, especially one that had occurred only a decade or two before. There still seems to be an element missing from Plato's sources for his story. Some researchers into Atlantis have posited a connection with the Nephilim. In the Bible, the Nephilim are a group of mysterious beings or giants who lived both before and after the flood. In some theories, the Nephilim are not human at all, but technologically advanced aliens who interbred with humans and developed the advanced culture of Atlantis. There have been objections to this idea, however, as there are no biblical references to the Nephilim either building anything or possessing advanced knowledge.
A few years ago, newspapers all over the world carried the story that ancient history researcher Robert Sarmast has located the lost continent of Atlantis off the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. Sonar scanning apparently revealed man-made structures in the water around the island, 1 mile beneath sea level. Sarmas believed that the Mediterranean basin was flooded in 9000 BC, which submerged a rectangular landmass which he maintains was Atlantis. Although archaeologists at the time dismissed Sarmas' claims out of hand, new evidence suggests there may indeed be an ancient city submerged in the waters around Cyprus. Atlantis everywhere. Almost every year without fail, the headline "Atlantis Found" blares out from various newspapers all over the world. In fact, the range of hypothetical locations for Atlantis is staggering. The Minoan civilization of late Bronze Age Crete, supposedly destroyed by a colossal earthquake on the neighboring island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, around 1450 BC, was long thought to have been an indirect influence on Plato's Atlantis. However, research into late Bronze Age Crete has shown that the Minoan civilization continued to flourish long after the Theran quake. This vast array of wildly different theories has contributed to the skepticism of many researchers, who believe that Plato's Atlantis was merely a political allegory designed to glorify Athens as the perfect state fighting against a decadent and greedy Atlantean empire. For them, the story begins and ends with Plato. Solon never visited Egypt and heard the story from the priests at Sais. They reason that Plato located Atlantis out in the Atlantic beyond the Pillars of Hercules, because in his time this vast ocean represented the limit of the world known to the Greeks. Atlantis researchers, of course, would completely disagree with this conclusion. Indeed, one of them, Iranian-American architect Robert Sarmast, believes he knows exactly where Atlantis is. Did Robert Sarmast find Atlantis off Cyprus? Sarmast first hit the headlines in November 2004 when newspapers carried the story that after nearly 10 years of research using ocean mapping technology and accounts from ancient texts, he'd located Atlantis off Cyprus. Sarmast was quoted as saying, "This is going to rewrite the history books. We are set to make the biggest archaeological discovery of all time." He claimed that around 9000 BC, the Mediterranean basin was flooded in a deluge that submerged a rectangular, man-made site which he believed was Atlantis. The lost civilization apparently lay around 5,000 feet below sea level, 50 miles or so off the southeastern coast of Cyprus. Sarmast and his team had carried out deep water sonar scanning, which indicated man-made structures on a submerged hill, including a wall almost 3 miles long, a walled hill summit, and deep trenches. Sarmast's 6-day expedition cost about $200,000 and was partly funded by the Cypriot Tourist Organization. Sarmast was quoted at the time as saying of his discoveries, "It is a miracle we found these walls, as their location and lengths match exactly the description of the Acropolis of Atlantis provided by Plato in his writings. We cannot yet provide tangible proof in the form of bricks and mortar, as the artifacts are still buried under several meters of sediment, but the circumstantial and other evidence is irrefutable. My discovery will vindicate Plato." Within his dialogues, Plato provides factual clues as to what Atlantis was like. "I have matched all but 2 of the 45 clues with the area around Cyprus. That's either the biggest coincidence in the history of the world, or we have found Plato's Atlantis." Plato's account is so detailed that it is possible to make city plans based on his description. These match exactly the antediluvian maps of Cyprus as discovered through oceanographic mapping. Sarmast had in fact revealed his discoveries the year before he hit the newspaper headlines in a book entitled Discovery of Atlantis, The Startling Case for the Island of Cyprus. At a 2004 press conference to announce his discoveries, Sarmast was challenged by Michel Morisseau, a French geologist who lives on Cyprus, to provide evidence that the Mediterranean had been flooded far more recently than the conventionally accepted 5 million years. Unfortunately, Sarmast was not able to provide any evidence whatever to back up his claims. Despo Pilides, an archaeologist at the Department of Antiquities in Cyprus, said of Sarmast's claims, "The latest theory should be taken with a very large pinch of salt. Archaeologists only work with hard evidence. There is no evidence whatsoever to give credence to this hypothesis, and we have no intention of investigating it." Commenting on Sarmast's interpretation of the sonar results, Benny Pisa, a social anthropologist at Liverpool John Moores University in the UK, criticised his far-fetched theories and unscientific approach. "Selective interpretation is nothing more than the blinkered reading of very ambiguous and unconvincing images," he said. "Anyone with a critical eye can pick out these images that they're far too vague and uncertain to be regarded as compelling evidence for any man-made structures. The very foundation on which the hoax is based is completely bogus. According to his theory, Mr. Sarmast claims that the Mediterranean basin was flooded in a deluge at around 9000 BC, which submerged a rectangular landmass he believes was Atlantis. The problem is, there is no evidence whatsoever for any large-scale flooding of the Mediterranean basin at that time. Not to be deterred, Sarmast organized a second expedition to the site in 2006, but results of the work were inconclusive. He returned to Cyprus in June 2011 to film a documentary in support of his Atlantis theory. He again had the backing of the Cyprus Tourism Organization as well as the History Channel, together with a number of private investors. However, Sarmast appears to have made no further discoveries at the supposed site of Atlantis, and nothing has been heard from him on the subject since 2013. New discoveries off Cyprus. However, the theory that ancient Atlantis may lie submerged in the waters off Cyprus does not seem to be dead yet. In April 2018, Cypriot newspaper The Cyprus Traveller announced that a chance discovery by a group of tourists had led a team of marine archaeologists to the location of Atlantis, off the coast of Paphos, a coastal city in southwest Cyprus. The team, led by archaeologist Marios Astio, used luge cutting-edge sonar technology to scan the ocean bed. After further surveillance, deep ground radar and digital mapping, a team was sent to the ocean floor where they discovered an ancient statue of Aphrodite. After extensive analysis, Professor Kostas Anotos from Cyprus University's Department of Antiquities authenticated the relic and confirmed that the extraordinary find was the first artifact that categorically proved that the great and wonderful empire of Atlantis was located off the coast of Paphos. A large-scale operation to recover further artifacts and building remains was soon underway, with the Cyprus Tourism Organization also planning to put out a tender for the building of a Paphos-based Atlantis museum. Marios Astio commented on the spectacular discoveries. Over the centuries, there's been heated debate over whether Atlantis was a mythical or historical location, with hundreds of archaeologists and geologists searching for its location. In fact, the reason I became a marine archaeologist was to try to discover the true location of Atlantis. Having completed my lifetime goal, I'm looking forward to enjoying an early retirement. He added, I was astounded when I heard that Astio and his team had discovered the location of the lost city of Atlantis, mainly because my great-grandmother always used to tell us Atlantis could be found at that exact spot in the ocean. No one listened to her, of course. It seemed the old bird was right. Marina Milona, a marketing and tourism officer at the Cyprus Tourism Organization, added, It's been long rumored that the lost city of Atlantis was located just off the coast of Cyprus, and we're delighted that this has been officially confirmed. Researchers at an Irish university have claimed that they have found proof that Ireland is the lost land of Atlantis. They say that the astonishing Neolithic temple tomb at Newgrange in the Boyne Valley is, in fact, the famous Temple of Atlantis and one of the oldest temples on Earth as a result. The researchers state that Atlantis Island was devastated by a huge tsunami triggered by a comet that hit Earth over 11,000 years ago. Other scholars say that Atlantis was not Ireland itself, but lay just off the country's west coast, perhaps the land once known as High Brazil. What is the evidence to back up such extreme claims? The Great Temple Tomb of Newgrange. One of the greatest archaeological achievements of prehistory, the vast Neolithic tomb Temple of Newgrange, is one of the earliest roofed buildings in the world. Newgrange was probably built around 3200 BC and consists of a passage running for 62 feet and a 20-foot high chamber with a corbelled roof, constructed of large stone slabs without mortar. The passage and chamber are covered by a huge stone and turf mound about 262 feet in diameter and around 44 feet high, surrounded at its base by 97 large stones known as curbstones, some of which are elaborately ornamented with megalithic art. For over 100 years, there has been speculation about who built Newgrange and what its primary function was. Excavations inside the chambers have revealed relatively few archaeological finds, probably because the majority had been removed in the centuries that the site remained open from 1699 until it was examined by archaeologist Professor Michael J. O'Reilly in 1962. The burials discovered consisted of 2 inhumations and at least 3 cremated bodies, all of which were found close to a huge stone basin, which seems to have been used for holding the bones of the dead. Archaeological finds inside the monument have not been spectacular, though a few gold objects have been found, including 2 gold torques, a piece of jewelry worn around the neck like a collar, a gold chain, 2 rings, a large phallus-like stone, a few pendants and beads, a bone chisel, and several bone pins. The lack of pottery finds at Newgrange is typical for passage grave cemeteries, which seem to have been places reserved for certain types of ritualistic activity involving a limited number of people. The entrance to the Newgrange passage tomb consists of a doorway composed of 2 standing stones and a horizontal lintel. Above the doorway is an aperture known as the roof box or light box. Every year, shortly after 9 a.m. on the morning of the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the sun begins its ascent across the Boyne Valley over a hill known locally as Red Mountain. The name possibly originates from the colour of the sunrise on this day. The newly risen sun then sends a shaft of sunlight directly through the Newgrange light box, which penetrates down the passageway as a narrow beam of light, illuminating the central chamber at the back of the tomb. After just 17 minutes, the ray of light narrows and the chamber is once more left in darkness. This spectacular event was in fact not rediscovered until 1967 by Professor Michael J. O'Reilly, though it had been known about in local folklore before that time. In fact, the monument was known locally as the Cave of the Sun. The Newgrange light box reveals in spectacular fashion the knowledge of surveying and basic astronomy possessed by the Neolithic inhabitants of the area. It also illustrates that for the people who aligned their monument with the winter solstice, the sun must have formed an important part of their religious beliefs. But some researchers think that Newgrange was something else entirely, no less than a temple of Poseidon in ancient Atlantis as described by Plato. Island as Atlantis. According to Swedish scientist Ulf Erlingsson, the mythical sunken island of Atlantis was actually Island. He bases his claim on the geographical details described by Plato in his original account of Atlantis in 360 BC, linking it to the story of Dogger Bank, a shoal off the coast of England that was sunk by a tidal wave in 6000 BC. Erlingsson described his theory in his 2004 book Atlantis from a Geographer's Perspective, Mapping the Fairyland. In January 2020, an organization calling itself Keystone University, which described itself as a new type of university that provides the best educational seminars on the planet, released a video on YouTube claiming that Island was ancient Atlantis. The organization claims on its website, Atlantis was a megalithic mother culture, an island in the Atlantic Ocean of seafaring people during the Stone Age. Our team have undertaken the largest ever investigation into the legend and have compiled overwhelming proof that the legend of Atlantis is loosely based on Stone Age Island. Our findings go completely against mainstream opinion and revolutionize human history. Our work will stand up to the highest levels of scrutiny, and we aim to have our work independently verified by impartial experts. Keystone University is not a real university. Its curriculum consists of brief seminars, 3 per year. One involves improving one's mental faculties, another concentrates on business skills, and the third is about ancient mysteries, including Atlantis and human evolution. Each 3-day seminar is available at the bargain cost of €1,000. There are numerous problems with identifying Island with Atlantis. The Irish myths and sagas linked to Newgrange and other megalithic monuments quoted by researchers in favour of the theory date to the early centuries AD, perhaps a few centuries earlier. Thus, they are many thousands of years later than the megalithic period and have no known connection with it. Plato wrote clearly that Atlantis was in front of the Pillars of Heracles. The entrance to the Strait of Gibraltar between Spain and Morocco, an island, is nowhere near there. Plato also said Atlantis was the size of Asia and Libya combined, while Ireland is many, many times smaller than this. But if Atlantis was not Ireland itself, could it have been located nearby? High Brazil. High Brazil, often called the Irish Atlantis, is a mythical island that is said to have once existed and may still exist in the Atlantic Ocean off the west coast of Ireland. In fact, it was often shown on old maps as a very small island in that location. An island named Brasil was first shown on a Portolan chart by Majorcan cartographer Angelino Dulcert in 1325. Venetian cartographer Andrea Bianco placed an island named Insula de Brazil on a chart in 1436. So real was High Brazil thought to be that a number of expeditions were launched to try to find it, all without success. There is one intriguing mention by Italian explorer John Cabot, who wrote in a letter while at sea in the area of High Brazil that the land he was approaching was also discovered in the past by men from Bristol who found High Brazil. Even more strangely, in 1674, a Captain Nisbet not only claimed to have found the island while sailing from France to Ireland, but that he'd also met its inhabitants, a solitary magician in a castle and a race of huge black rabbits. What the truth of these strange assertions are, or what they were based on, if anything, no one has ever been able to find out. Despite the lack of evidence, the Phantom Island continued to appear on maps until 1873, when it was shown for the last time on a British Admiralty chart. Because of its description and location, a number of researchers have linked High Brazil to Plato's Atlantis. According to Irish legend, High Brazil is a mysterious island forever blanketed in thick fog and invisible to the naked eye, only except for one day every 7 years when it is visible from the west of Ireland. The name High Brazil originated from Celtic mythology. As early as the 12th century, locals believed in the existence of a mysterious island that could be seen along the west coast of Ireland once every 7 years. There was an oral tradition of stories about an island in a fog bank or a floating island that would disappear when people approached it. According to Barry Cunliffe, professor of European archaeology at Oxford University, the story of High Brazil has a long history, predating its appearance on 14th century maps. The legend goes back much further, probably into pre-Christian times, appearing first in the 7th century in the Irish text known as the Adventure of Bran Sola Febal, which tells of Bran's visit to this other-world island supported on pillars of gold where games are played, people are always happy, there is no sorrow or sickness, and music is always to be heard. Truly a land of the blessed. One or two researchers are of the opinion that the stories of Atlantis and High Brazil may have a common origin. They believe that both legends may be based on a common ancient source. A story was passed down through generations from the end of the last ice age when sea levels were much lower. Though that is an extraordinary length of time for a story to have survived, it's not completely beyond the realms of possibility. The Welsh Atlantis is a legendary ancient sunken kingdom said to have occupied land between Ramsey Island and Bardsey Island in what is now Cardigan Bay in the west of Wales. When Storm Francis hit England and Wales in late August 2020, it uncovered a petrified forest buried in sand more than 4,500 years ago, which researchers believe is part of this legendary Atlantis of Wales. There are many fascinating tales in Welsh literature and folklore of sunken lands, both on the coast and in lakes. These lost lands can be cities, towns, palaces, or fertile plains, and each story may have several versions dating from various periods. One example is Kenfig, which lies in Swansea Bay in southwest Wales. The medieval town of Kenfig was engulfed by the ever-changing and drifting dunes of Kenfig Burrows, and nowadays only its castle keep is visible. But according to legend, the bells of the sunken church tower can be heard on misty nights just before a storm. Llangors Lake in the stunning Brecon Beacons National Park in mid-Wales was said by Gerald of Wales to contain a drowned city beneath its waters. English churchman and writer Walter Map, in a manuscript of anecdotes and tales held by the library in Oxford, known as the Trifle of Courtiers, recounts a similar folk tale about a palace or town within Llangors Lake which was submerged because of the wickedness of the prince and his subjects. This tale may be a folk memory of the small man-made island, or crannog, which was constructed as a fortified palace by Brychan, king of Brachinaiog, on the lake during the late 9th century and destroyed in AD 916 by a Mercian from the Midlands of England army. On the northwestern tip of mainland Wales near Llandudno, there once stood Cles Helig, the palace of 6th century Prince Helig ap Glanawg. One night, during a feast at the palace, a huge wave surged over them and left the whole area underwater. At very low tides, it is said that the ruins of the old palace can still be seen under the water. There are later embellishments to the myth, including a tale that it was Glanwig's daughter of Gwendwyd's unfaithfulness in love which had caused the flood. Perhaps the best known of these sunken lands, and one that is sometimes known as the Welsh Atlantis, is Cantra Gwylod, the Lowland Hundred. This legendary ancient drowned kingdom is said to lie between the waters of Cardigan Bay on the Welsh coast, between Ramsey Island and Bardsey Island. According to the legend, it was a fertile land, 40 miles in length and 20 in breadth, with 16 fortified towns, including its principal city of Caer Wydno. The fort or palace, all protected from the sea by a dike and sluices. One night around year AD 600, the Longshanks ruled the area. There was a severe storm that whipped up huge waves which crashed against the sea walls and threatened the kingdom. The keeper of the dike was a man called Sithen Hin, apparently a drunkard who on the night negligently left the sluice gates open to the sea, and it came rushing in, flooding the land and drowning the towns and most of the inhabitants. It is said that when the sea is calm and the waters clear, the submerged buildings can be glimpsed beneath the waves, and the sound of its church bells heard faintly ringing out from the depths of the sea. There are many versions of the same story in existence, but where do these tales originate, and do they have any basis in fact? This version of the story only dates back to the mid-17th century, but there is much earlier references to the drowning in the Black Book of Carmarthen, dating to about the mid-13th century, one of the earliest surviving manuscripts written entirely in Welsh. The tradition that cities were overwhelmed by floods as divine retribution because of the evil ways of their inhabitants is probably derived from the biblical stories of Noah's flood and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But the various Welsh flood tales are so similar that it's probable that they go back to a common origin of early Celtic literature. But is the common origin a purely fictitious one, or was there an actual cataclysmic flood somewhere in the realms of the Celtic world on which most or all of these accounts are based? While the idea that the myths contain folk memories of gradually rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age is an attractive one, it is perhaps unlikely that stories could have survived, even in vague form, by being handed down for 10,000 years or so. There have, however, been one or two intriguing sightings of these places over the years. In 1770, Welsh antiquarian William Owen Pugh reported glimpsing the ruins of the lost land 4 miles off the Welsh coast in Cardigan Bay. In the 1846 edition of the Topographical Dictionary of Wales, Samuel Lewis records a feature he described as a collection of loose stones he had seen in Cardigan Bay, which he calls Caer Wydno, or the Fort Palace of Gwythno. He also says the depth of water over the whole extent of the Bay of Cardigan is not great, and on the recess of the tide, stones bearing Latin inscriptions and Roman coins of various emperors have been found below high water marks in different places in the water, and also are observed prostrate trees. The truth appears to be that the inundation swept away only a small part and not the whole of the land now covered by the waters of the bay. Intriguingly, at low tides, in the remains of a preserved sunken forest have been recorded in Cardigan Bay on the coast between Borth near Aberystwyth and Unilas. The oldest sections of this prehistoric forest date back to 3500 BC, though the part at Borth is thought to date to around 1500 BC. Some researchers have linked these trees with the lost sunken land in the area, perhaps the Welsh Atlantis of legend. In August and September 2020, Storm Francis battered the UK, and the west coast of Wales was particularly affected. As a result of the havoc caused by the gale-force wind and torrential rain, further parts of the petrified woodland, submerged for 4,500 years, was exposed. The petrified trees, uncovered at the seaside village of Llanrhystr, are believed to be part of the same forest recovered at low tide on Borth's beach, 13 miles to the north in Cardigan Bay. Previously, experts had believed that the ancient forest stretched for about 3 miles along the shore, before eventually being buried under layers of peat, sand and salt water. However, this new finding would suggest that the woodland is far bigger and wider reaching than previously believed. The pine, alder, oak and birch trees in this forest are thought to have stopped growing between 4,500 and 6,000 years ago due to the rise in the world's sea levels. A thick blanket of peat then formed, suffocating the trees. Perhaps this ancient forest was part of the Welsh Atlantis, and further extreme weather in the area may reveal not only tree stumps, but also ancient buildings and artifacts. Though there is practically no physical evidence for this fabled civilization, said by folklore to lie under the sea, a conservation group called Friends of Cardigan Bay believe that there is some truth to the tale, and have begun a project to study the ecology of the seabed in the area. Perhaps this project, the first serious ecological research into Cardigan Bay, will one day show that this land was more than just a legend.
The ancient city of Iram, or Atlantis of the Sands, as it was once described by T.E. Lawrence, is a semi-legendary place in the southern deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, mentioned in several ancient texts including the Holy Quran and 1001 Nights. The city, once the home of giants and magical creatures known as jinn, is believed to have been destroyed by a natural disaster sent by God as a punishment, but its location has remained a mystery for 2,000 years. The city is thought to have been obscured by a massive sandstorm, which covered it completely, making its discovery all the more difficult for the countless explorers who searched for it. But now researchers believe they have located it. The city of Iram has an extremely long history. The earliest mention of Iram is in the Ebla tablets. These are around 1800 cuneiform tablets and 4,700 fragments, representing the palace archives of the ancient city of Ebla, Syria, long known from Egyptian and Akkadian inscriptions. They all date to the period between 2500 BC and the destruction of the city around 2250 BC. The most complete description of the city of Iram comes from the Quran, the earliest complete text to explain the city of Iram and give a complete account. Iram is also prominent in the collection of Middle Eastern folk tales known as 1001 Nights. In these stories, it is King Shaddad who orders the building of the city of Iram, called in that text Many-Columned Iram. I find in ancient books and annals a description of paradise as it is to be in the next world, and I desire to build me its like in this world. Go ye forth therefore to the goodliest tract on earth and the most spacious, and build me there a city of gold and silver, whose gravel shall be chrysolite, and rubies and pearls, and for support of its vaults make pillars of jasper. Fill it with palaces whereon ye shall set galleries and balconies, and plant its lanes and thoroughfares with all manner of trees, bearing yellow ripe fruits, and make rivers to run through it in channels of gold and silver. King Shaddad assembled together those who would build the mighty city. They came from all lands and countries, architects, engineers, craftsmen, and labourers. The king ordered them to search the earth until they found the right place to build his city of paradise. Eventually they came to an uninhabited spot, a vast open plain clear of sandhills and mountains, with rivers flowing around it, and they said, "This is the manner of place the king commanded us to seek and ordered us to find." So the workmen began building Iram, but so rich in decoration and complicated in plan was the city that it wasn't completed for another 300 years. When the long-lived King Shaddad was told that it was completed, he said to the workmen, "Depart and make thereon an impregnable castle, rising and towering high in air, and build around it 1,000 pavilions, each upon 1,000 columns of chrysolite and ruby and vaulted with gold, that in each pavilion a wazir may dwell." So they returned to the city immediately, and after working for another 20 years, they once again presented themselves before King Shaddad and informed him of the completion of the task. The great king then commanded his wazirs, who were 1,000 in number, and his chief officers and such of his troops and others as he put trust in, to prepare for departure and removal to many-columned Iram, in the suite and at the stirrup of Shaddad, son of Ad, king of the world. And he bade also such as he would of his women and of his harem and of his handmaids and eunuchs make them ready for the journey. Some researchers have identified the city of Iram with ancient Ubar. Indeed, for many, they're the same place. In the 1990s, it was announced that the lost city of Ubar had been found in the village today known as Shisr, in the Dhofar region of Oman. A New York Times article from February 1992 announced what had been discovered. Guided by ancient maps and sharp-eyed surveys from space, archaeologists and explorers have discovered a lost city deep in the sands of Arabia, and they are virtually sure it is Ubar, the fabled entrepot of the rich frankincense trade thousands of years ago. Leaders of the expedition reported that excavations so far have uncovered the ruins of 8 towers and adjoining walls, and deposits of pottery dating to Roman times and as far back as 2000 BC, perhaps earlier. They said the location and size of the site and evidence of a violent destruction appeared to match historical accounts of Ubar's rise and fall. Much research has tied Ubar to the city Iram in the Quran and to Amarnam Emporium on the maps of Claudius Ptolemy, the Alexandrian geographer of the 2nd century AD. Other researchers are not convinced by this discovery. They believe the lost city of Iram of the Pillars remains to be found concealed beneath the sand elsewhere in the vast Rub al-Khali desert on the Arabian Peninsula. To add to the confusion, at least one academic believes that Ubar, and therefore Iram, refers not to a city but to a people. Archaeologist Yuris Zarins discussed Ubar in a 1996 interview with PBS Nova. There's a lot of confusion about that word. If you look at the classical texts and the Arab historical sources, Ubar refers to a region and a group of people, not to a specific town. People always overlook that. It's very clear on Ptolemy's 2nd century map of the area. It says in big letters, Iobaritai, and in his text that accompanied the maps he's very clear about that. It was only the late medieval version of 1001 Nights in the 14th or 15th century that romanticized Ubar and turned it into a city rather than a region or a people. There are many folk tales and legends surrounding the city of Iram. The remains of the city are haunted by the creatures that once inhabited its peaceful streets, turned to jinn by their materialistic desires. Some ancient traditions even say that Iram was built by the jinn themselves before the time of Adam and was only later inhabited by men. This tradition seems to come from the name Iram of the Pillars, the ancient Arabic word for pillar corresponding to Old One. The name therefore was a city of the Old Ones, in other words, the jinn. Jinn are believed to be powerful, invisible beings capable of possessing people and even causing them suffering. There are numerous stories of human encounters with jinn, which have persuaded some researchers that the stories of them building the ancient city of Iram may have some basis in fact. Indeed, the Quran clearly confirms their existence and even considers them an independent nation. There is a whole chapter in the Quran entitled the Chapter of Jinn, where detailed information about these supernatural beings is revealed. The Islamic belief that jinn belong to another nation that exists parallel to humans in another dimension is not too dissimilar to the belief in fairies in rural Ireland. Jinn are believed to be invisible and possess enormous power and are not affected by the laws of physics. They exist partly in the physical world and are able to move across dimensional boundaries. Jinn can also travel anywhere in the blink of an eye and change into the shape of anything they desire, such as cats, dogs, and even humans. In some versions of myths surrounding the construction of the city of Iram, King Shaddad was helped by a tribe of giants, or according to some legends, a legion of demons or jinn, before the time of man, thus making it the oldest city on earth. In the Quran, the city of Iram is associated with a mighty tribe known as the Ad. The tribe of Ad bears a close resemblance to the biblical Nephilim, which were believed to be a race of giants and credited with building the city of Enoch. Islamic scholar and historian Ibn Khaldun, writing in the 14th century, described with some skepticism some of the legends surrounding the lost city. It is said to have been a large city with castles of gold and silver and columns of emerald and hyacinth, containing all kinds of trees and flowing rivers. Some go so far in their crazy talk as to maintain that the city lies hidden from sensual perception and can be discovered only by trained magicians and sorcerers. Perhaps one day the real Iram of the Pillars, if it ever existed, will be identified for certain. But even if it remains elusive, its mystery has captured the imagination of poets, explorers, and archaeologists for hundreds of years, right up until the present day. The video game Uncharted 3 includes a dramatic reconstruction of a vast, extravagant city emerging from a desert called Iram and named the Atlantis of the Sands.
Some researchers believe that a map of Atlantis created in the 16th century shows Atlantis was in fact South America. They reason that if this was the case, the culture of the Aztecs, Maya, and other Central and South American cultures were directly influenced by the inhabitants of Atlantis. Other writers have suggested that gods from the East, sometimes seen as Atlanteans, arrived in remote times to influence the native culture of the area. When Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, people started to become aware that the world was a much bigger place than they'd ever imagined. So perhaps it's not a coincidence that prior to the late 15th century, there were no explorers, writers, or scientists advocating the existence of Atlantis. After Columbus, Atlantis began to be reborn in the popular consciousness, with some writers and researchers beginning to think that it may actually have been a real place. 17th century German Jesuit scholar Kircher published around 40 major works during his lifetime. In 1664, Kircher decided to create a map of Atlantis. Kircher's map places the south at the top of the map, possibly a reference to ancient Egyptian beliefs about cardinal directions or his own theories about water traveling through the center of the Earth from the South to North Pole. Kircher's map of Atlantis proved to some people that the Atlantis myth must have had a basis in reality. Where the shape of Kircher's Atlantis came from is somewhat of a mystery. Kircher himself stated that it was based on Egyptian maps and the writings of Plato, while other records claim that he found an ancient map in archives somewhere and copied it. Others allege that he borrowed the map's image from contemporary depictions of South America. It certainly matches closely Abraham Ortelius's map of South America, published in 1592, though turned upside down. One of the results of the similarities of Kircher's map with that of the outline of South America was to influence some writers and researchers to look for traces of Atlantis in the Americas. Over the years, a number of researchers and authors have put forward the idea that Plato's mythical Atlantis was located in the Americas. They reason that the continent matches the vast proportions of the Atlantic island described in Plato's work, and that the ancient Greek author was somehow aware of its existence on the other side of the Western Ocean, perhaps through trader stories. Beginning in the 19th century, various writers proposed that the Toltecs and the Aztecs were members of the Nahuatl race, which originated in Atlantis. When Atlantis submerged in the Atlantic, they migrated to North America and eventually to the Valley of Mexico. The language that was spoken by the Aztec and Toltec peoples of Mexico has often been put forward as an explanation for the word Atlantis. Indeed, some researchers believe that the word Atlantis has an origin in that language. The word Atlan combines atl, meaning water, with tlan, which can mean into, under, or in. So Atlantan could mean in between the water or the water in between. According to 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus, a Phoenician expedition circumnavigated Africa sometime between 610 and 595 BC. The ancient historian Didorius Siculus states that Phoenician ships traveled as far as the Canary Islands, Madeira, and the Azores. Perhaps a Phoenician expedition was blown off course by a severe storm, driving the ships as far as Central America. Could the Phoenician sailors have picked up the story of Atlantis from the inhabitants there and transferred it back to the Mediterranean? While this is a possibility, albeit rather remote, to date there is no archaeological evidence to confirm that Phoenicians, or any other ancient Mediterranean culture, ever crossed the Atlantic. One proposed location for Atlantis in the Americas is Tenochtitlan, the ancient capital of the Aztec Empire, located on the ancient site of Mexico City. An early description often called it the Atlantis of the ancient Aztec Empire. It certainly has hints of Plato's Atlantis. It was written by Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a Spanish conquistador who participated as a soldier in the conquest of Mexico under Hernán Cortés. Part of his description of the great city reads, "When we saw so many cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, we were amazed and said that this was like the enchantments, on account of the great towers and quays and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. I do not know how to describe it. Seeing things as we did had never been heard or seen of before, not even dreamed about." In many ways, it was similar to Plato's Atlantis. The entire city was built on an island in what was then Lake Texcoco in the Valley of Mexico, and also possessed a complex series of canals that connected all the sections of the city. One legend connected with the foundation of the ancient city tells that it was populated by a group of Nahua tribes migrating from Aztlan, a place whose exact location remains a mystery, though many researchers have linked it with Atlantis. It's not just the Aztecs who've been an alleged Atlantis connection. In his 1973 book, Atlantis, Mother of Empires, author Robert B. Stacy Judd wrote that the Mayan civilization had arrived in Central America as the last significant surviving group of the fully developed Atlantean Empire from the Antilles. The Mayan books Chilambalam and Popol Vuh state that the first inhabitants of the Yucatan were the Chans coming from the east in 219 AD. The Spanish bishop Diego de Landra arrived in the Yucatan shortly after Cortés, and he said that the Maya told him that their ancestors had come from the east. Spanish writers of the 17th and 18th centuries concluded that the Olmecs had preceded the Toltecs and that they had come from the east, perhaps from Atlantis. In the mid-19th century, the Abbé de Brasbourg, a Catholic priest and journalist, apparently gained access to official records in Mexico City. From these records, he learned that Atlantis was the true cradle of civilization, disappearing in a cataclysm in 9937 BC. He believed that the culture and society of Atlantis was continued by the ancient Maya civilization, and that there were extensive parallels between the Maya and Egyptian pantheons and cosmologies, due to the fact that they had both had an origin on the lost continent of Atlantis. From perusing the archives, he put together a theory that the Atlantean continent had originally occupied the Gulf of Mexico, extending into the Caribbean Sea as far as the Canary Islands. It had been destroyed in several disastrous cataclysms between 9937 and 10,500 BC, though succeeding upheavals restored parts of the Yucatan, Honduras, and Guatemala. In his book published in 1862, he wrote that Atlantis, as described by Plato, had existed with a high level of civilization long before the beginning of civilizations in Europe and Asia. He also put forward the idea that the origins of European and Persian words could be traced back to indigenous languages of the Americas. He even suggested that Latin languages were derived of Quiche Maya, and the myth of Quetzalcoatl could be traced to Plato's Atlantis. Atlantis has not been the only civilization put forward as being a civilizing influence on ancient Central and South American cultures. In his 1961 book, A Quest of the White God, French-German diplomat Pierre Honoré explored the legends which persisted among the natives of Central and South America of pre-Columbian visitors, revered as gods that had come from the East. He concluded that the most important cultural and political influences on the Inca, Mayan, Aztec and other pre-Columbian cultures were contributed by traders from the ancient Mediterranean world, most especially from Crete. According to Honoré, white-skinned Bronze Age Minoans interacted with Native Americans and brought a system of science and engineering, gave them their legal codes, and helped them achieve a high level of civilization. The Minoan culture on Crete was at its peak between 1700 and 1450 BC, with the great city of Knossos and the surrounding settlement having a population of perhaps as many as 100,000. There is no evidence that all the Minoans had any connection with peoples outside the Mediterranean, never mind across the Atlantic in Central America. Critics of Honoré's work correctly point out that it was racially insensitive, and that the list of gifts bestowed on the Central and South American native populations was uncannily similar to that the French claimed to confer on the colonized peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, even as their empire was collapsing. The Guanches were the first known inhabitants of the Canary Islands off the coast of northwestern Africa, but their true origins have long been a mystery to archaeologists. They were accomplished astronomers, and for some, their mummification rituals link them to the ancient Egyptians, whilst for others, their legends suggest they could even be surviving inhabitants of Atlantis. New scientific evidence may have found the truth about these mysterious people. Recently, archaeological excavations revealed that the inhabitants of the Canary Island traded with Rome, and new DNA evidence has shed some light on the origins of the population. The Canary Islands. The Canary Islands are an autonomous community of Spain, consisting of an archipelago in the Atlantic Ocean, southwest of the Iberian Peninsula, and 76 miles off the coast of Morocco. The 8 main islands are Tenerife, Fuerteventura, Gran Canaria, Lanzarote, La Palma, La Gomera, El Hierro, and La Graciosa. The Canary Islands are volcanic islands and are essentially the peaks of a huge volcanic mountain range, now partially submerged. The first historical record of the islands so far discovered is from the 1st century Roman writer Pliny the Younger. An expedition to the islands was apparently sent by Juba II, the Roman client king of Numidia and Mauritania, in around 30 BC. Under the Roman Catholic Republic and Empire, Numidia consisted of a part of Africa north of the Sahara, corresponding roughly to the modern western Tunisia and eastern Algeria. It was during this expedition that the islands got their name of the Canary Islands because of the multitude of large dogs found there, the Roman word canis meaning dog. After the fall of the Roman Empire, we hear nothing of the islands for hundreds of years until around 1000 AD, when the Arabs landed and traded with the inhabitants of Gran Canaria. In 1150 AD, the Arab geographer Muhammad al-Idrisi compiled the first official account of the population of the islands, which consisted of short descriptions of sailors and traders' accounts of the time. During the 15th and 16th century, Spain and Portugal began colonizing the Americas and Africa, stopping off at the Canary Islands along the way. When they arrived on the Canary Islands, they encountered a culture that resembled the Neolithic cultures of prehistoric Europe. Complete Spanish conquest of the islands was completed in 1496, and they became a vital Spanish base on sea routes to the Americas. As a result of Spanish colonization, the diseases introduced by the European conquerors and the slave trade by the native Guanches of the island chain were decimated, losing much of their culture in the process. By the 19th century, the Canary Islanders had even lost their language as it came to be replaced by Spanish. There are still, however, some reminders of the once thriving culture of the Guanches of the Canary Islands. The Guanches. The Guanches were the first known inhabitants of the Canary Islands, the indigenous people when the Spanish arrived there in the 15th century. They lived mainly in natural caves or occasionally built low stone huts and small fortifications. The Guanches lived off farming and herding, had a diet which included milk, goat, pork and fruits, and dressed mainly in goatskin leather tunics and vests made of plaited rushes. Archaeological research suggests that they were organized in a tribal society ruled by chieftains or kings. The Guanches were not skilled sailors, and therefore the culture of each of the Canary Islands developed differently. In Tenerife, for example, the Guanche civilization was divided into 9 small kingdoms, each led by a ruling mensi. Caves were also used for grain storage and as temples, and some are still preserved today and demonstrate the sophisticated astronomical knowledge of the Guanches. The most impressive of these structures is Risco Caído, a vast cultural site covering around 18,000 hectares on the island of Gran Canaria. The archaeological site consists of 21 caves containing significant rock art believed to relate to magical or religious beliefs and fertility rituals. One of these caves has a small opening in its roof, where light enters from the summer solstice to autumn, allowed sunlight and moonlight to enter the caves and illuminate symbolic engravings on the walls. Because of this, many archaeologists think that Risco Caído could have been used by the prehistoric inhabitants as a primitive astronomical clock. Over the years, there have been a number of finds made in the Canary Islands which suggested some sort of contact with the Roman world. In 1964, a Roman amphora, storage jar, was discovered in waters off Lanzarote, and since that time other examples have been found underwater. None, however, could be securely dated. A few years ago, however, excavations on the island of Lanzarote uncovered the first securely dated evidence of Roman trade with the islands. Investigations at the prehistoric settlement of El Belvedero yielded around 100 Roman pot shards, 9 pieces of metal and 1 piece of glass. The artifacts were found in archaeological levels which indicate that they dated between the 1st and 4th centuries AD. Legends of Atlantis and Ancient Egypt. There are numerous legends surrounding the native people of the Canary Islands. Some believe they were somehow related to the Celts, or perhaps even the Vikings. Others that the Guanches were descended from the inhabitants of the mythical land of Atlantis. In this theory, Cape Verde, the Azores, Madeira and the Canary Islands would be the remains of this legendary sunken continent. A more recent theory connects the first settlers of the Canary Islands with the Berber Canary tribe. The Guanches have also been linked to ancient Egyptians, perhaps as a colony of that civilization because of their habit of mummifying their dead. It is a fact that the Guanches used similar methods to the ancient Egyptians when preserving the remains of their high-ranking citizens. After the mummification process, the bodies were buried underground or inside caves. Unfortunately, many of these mummies were stolen or looted by later grave robbers, though some have managed to survive. The Guanche mummy of Madrid is perhaps the best preserved of the Guanche mummies, as its careful embalming kept its organs intact and even preserved the man's hair. The man, who died during his early 30s, was mummified between the 11th and 13th centuries AD, just a few centuries before the Spanish invaded the Canary Islands. New DNA evidence. In June 2019, it was announced that DNA studies had resolved many of the outstanding questions regarding the origins of the Guanches. Dr. Linus Girdland-Flink, a researcher at Liverpool John Moores University in the UK, who was part of the research team, stated, Previous studies of the Guanches relied on single genetic markers, such as the mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes. These markers often lack the analytical precision needed to resolve finer levels of population history. By sequencing autosomal DNA, we gained unique insights to the ancestry and origin of these populations. The researcher team generated the genome-wide sequence data and mitochondrial genomes from 11 Guanche individuals originating from archaeological sites in Gran Canaria and Tenerife. Leading author of the study, Dr. Ricardo Rodriguez Varela, a researcher at Stockholm University, explained the results of the team's fascinating study. By generating the first autosomal genetic data from these populations, we can conclusively demonstrate that the Guanches were most closely related to modern North Africans of Berber ancestry than to any other population we included for comparisons, supporting previous studies but adding more detail and nuance. The study was also able to show that the modern inhabitants of Gran Canaria inherited between 16 and 31% of their genomic ancestry from the Guanches. The Berbers spread throughout North Africa more than 3,000 years ago, occupying what is today the area from Libya to the Sahara. Rosa Friegel, a geneticist at La Laguna University, who took part in the research, said of the results, "Thanks to DNA analysis, we've been able to dispel the notion that the Guanches were practically Vikings, tall, blonde and blue-eyed. Everything indicates that they came from North Africa and were physically similar to the Berbers. White skin with a tendency to an olive complexion and brown eyes that could be light-colored in some cases." Clichés and legends notwithstanding, the ancient inhabitants of the Canary Islands were not so different from today's. But the question is, if the original inhabitants of the Canary Islands came from North Africa, how and when did they arrive? Archaeologists believe that there were two major migrations, the first around 2,500 years ago, and the second one at around the 1st century AD, when North Africa was part of the Roman Empire. They are believed to have made the crossing in relatively small vessels, although no remains of these have ever been found. In February 2020, it was announced that the mummified remains of 72 individuals had been discovered by amateur archaeologists using a drone in a cave on Gran Canaria. Aros Hima Gonzalez, who made the incredible discovery, said, "We were flying a drone and we took some pictures of the cave. It is in a very difficult place to access and you need to climb a cliff to reach the site. People thought the photos were fake because of all the bones there, but they were not fake and the bones are believed to belong to Guanche mummified remains." Archaeologist Veronica Alberto and culture counsellor Javier Velasca confirmed the discovery, stating that the cave dates back to between the 8th and 10th centuries AD. If you read about Edgar Cayce, called the Sleeping Prophet, you can't stop trying to learn more about him and his readings. We first learned of his existence by reading the books of the great Charles Berlitz, The Mystery of Atlantis, and Atlantis, the Eighth Continent, and were fascinated. The story, the mystery, and Edgar Cayce. In his readings, that's what his sessions were called, he talked about many things, among them wars, spirituality, healing, finding objects, and even the best place to look for oil, and Atlantis. But let's do what we always have to do, start with the beginning. Edgar Cayce was born on a farm in Hoppingville, Kentucky on March the 18th, 1877. Since childhood, he had imaginary friends with whom he would chat for a while and then disappear. He even came to speak with the spirit of his grandfather. He also had the ability to memorize a book, simply sleeping on it. These gifts made him consider it strange or strange in his environment, although he only wanted to help people, preferably children. They say that when he was a child, he was beaten by a baseball and taken to hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Surprisingly, in a few seconds, he woke up completely healthy. In his town, he studied until finishing high school and started working, selling insurance for the company Woodman of the World. He also joined Disciples of Christ as a missionary, selling Bibles and things like that. Sometime later, he left his job, He lost his voice because he became ill with laryngitis, and with the money saved, he opened a photographic studio. In 1901, a hypnotist only known as Hart the Laughing Man came to town, claiming to cure diseases. Casey underwent a trance with Hart to recover his voice, but without results. Another hypnotist called Al Lane proposed to do something similar to help him. Casey went into a trance quickly, recovered, and started talking, but he referred to it as we. Lane asked him what Casey was going through, and the entity answered, poor circulation in his throat. And immediately, this entity healed Casey, who recovered the voice immediately. Lane and Casey partnered to help more people, Casey in trance and Lane directing the readings. In these readings, Casey was dedicated to the most varied topics, from curing people to discovering lost objects. He even healed people from a distance with the data that people sent him by letter. There was even the case of a letter received asking for help from a girl who was very sick. Casey went into a trance and saw that the girl had fallen from a horse, hurting her back, and through this wound, a bacterium had entered the girl and made her sick. Instead of prescribing a medication, Casey said that they should do massages in certain places on the girl's back. After the massages, the girl didn't recover. Casey, in trance again, said that the massages were not well done and ordered to perform them in the way he said. The massages were done correctly and the girl was relieved almost immediately. Sleeping Prophet. When Casey went into a trance, he could do many things, even communicate with entities, cure from a distance, diagnose illnesses, and prescribe cures, and so on. But when he woke up, he didn't remember anything. So people had to write in detail everything he said. All these documents still exist and are part of an immense collection that survived. In 1912, Casey moved to Texas. There he worked reading, looking for oil, but something strange happened. The place indicated for a well where they began to build. It was abandoned due to lack of financing. Casey assured that it was a punishment for seeking a profit from his reading. Then he created a card game called PIT on the stock market after returning to his hometown. In 1923, Arthur Lammers, who printed Casey's game, asked for a reading and he accepted. When Lammers began to ask about life and death, the hereafter and reincarnation, Edgar became angry and distorted the rules for his readings, would not talk about these issues, and would always take notes of his readings. In 1925, during a reading, an entity asked Casey to move to Virginia Beach, Virginia, and to open a hospital because the sands of that place had healing properties. He got the funding and created the Casey Hospital, where he diagnosed diseases and prescribed treatments and cures, from a diet change to surgery. The readings, too, dealt with everything from priests to occultism and esotericism. At this time, Casey preferred his method of sleeping prophet, doing readings for 6 hours, by order of the entities which he communicated with. In 1929, Morton Blumenthal, who gave him the money to create Casey Hospital, asked him to read about the stock market. Casey told him that the stock market would collapse and there was no time to fix it. As it's known, in October of that year, there was the biggest stock market crash in the world, a financial crash that left Blumenthal in ruins, and for this reason, the hospital had to close. This marked the end of Casey's public life. Akashic Records. He concentrated on group studies where his lectures focused on astrology, karma, occultism, and so on, creating the concept of the Akashic Record. The Akashic Records are, in short, a kind of flash memory of everything, absolutely everything, past, present, future, that we carry in our experiences and thoughts. Like a large library that can be accessed with concentration and where we can obtain ancient and future knowledge. With concentration and studies, anyone can access that registry. It's as if we obtain the password of a protected hard drive, but that password means years of study and concentration. According to this, the great scholars, the great mediums, could access constantly, as Edgar Casey did. A clear example of this would be Baba Vanga. Baba Vanga was born as Vangelia Pandeva Dimitrovia in the small town of Strumica in present-day Macedonia in 1911. As a child, she was dragged for 2 kilometers and suffered serious injuries, which left her blind for life. Her life from that blindness changed, and not only to stop seeing, but also she heard a voice that gave her information about the future. This voice, for example, told her that there would be a great war that would face many countries in Europe, which became the First World War. There are scattered throughout the internet pages that speak of the large number of prophecies, some fulfilled, of Baba Vanga. But this leaves us a question. Could Baba Vanga and other prophets access the Akashic record of which Edgar Cayce spoke? I postulate that yes, for different reasons, they could get the password of the records without study or concentration. Cayce, in this case, had a lifetime of concentration and perfection of his gifts, and for this he could access the records. Beyond his readings and the different topics he dealt with in his readings, one of the topics he most talked about was Atlantis. Cayce spoke of Mu, Lemuria and Atlantis, although he was more passionate with Atlantis. He even called her Poseidia, and many of his readings dedicate to her. Even more than 700 of Cayce's 2,500 readings refer to Atlantis incarnations. Cayce said that the golden age of the Atlanteans was led by a group of spiritual society called the Law of One, which governed the continent, leading to prosperity and unprecedented technological growth. Scientifically advanced, they had flying ships, submarines, and a system very similar to television. Remember that when Cayce talked about this, television didn't exist, nor was it a project even. He also talks about computer-like devices. The source of energy used for all of these were some crystals that had different uses, from energy for appliances and vehicles to magnetic fields, calibrate farms, healing, creation of better agricultural conditions, and a big etc. According to Cayce, in the golden age of the Atlanteans, many of them didn't depend on human bodies. These extraterrestrials had a luminous form. Among them were the Syrians, the Arcturians, and the Pleiadians. They came to live here up to 10,000 years ago. According to Cayce, after the Golden Age, Atlantis suffered a schism, where each island of the continent began to be a kind of sovereign state. The largest islands were the three, Arion, Og, and Poseida, and each had its own idiosyncrasy. Arion was stronger militarily, in addition to having full control of the technology. Always according to the stories of Edgar Cayce, Atlantis was destroyed by this technology. By continuous and massive mega-explosions. It was a matter of months because of the Aryans, who were against the Law of One, deeply rooted in Poseidia. This destruction occurred almost immediately. Although there were weeks or months, the destruction could not be prevented from day one, and occurred in 10,500 BC. Many of the Atlanteans warned of the great destruction and began to abandon the islands, going to Europe, America, and mainly Africa. Always following with the story of Cayce, followers of the Law of One went mainly to Egypt, Bolivia, Yucatan, and Arkansas. They could prosper for a while in those places, but with the sinking of large tracts of land, they decided to leave, most of them leaving the planet at least. With this, Atlantis had definitely disappeared. So how did Cayce know about Atlantia, being able to give so many details about economics, literature, technology, and so on? Did he have the password for the Akashico records? Beyond developing the concept, it was evident that he could enter the great bookseller of the records very easily, since his biographers say that he went into a trance in 2 or 3 minutes and had strict instructions to take notes and even record the readings. Hence, so much of his work has been recorded. To read everything related to Cayce would be a job that would take a lifetime for the quantity and quality of the stories. Fortunately, scattered throughout the internet we have readings and many of them are interpreted. Can anyone enter the Akashic records as Cayce did? The answer is yes. We've shown it with Cayce and with Mama Banga, who, by traumatic event, got the password from the large library of Akashic records. Obviously, these records, like a library, have different shelves and shelves to serve the information. Mama Banga talked about disasters, the future, gave news and warnings and so on, while Cayce was more spiritual, healings and communicated topics that could later be called New Age, about love and well-being. And about Atlantis, of course. Also speaking about Atlantis, he spoke of love and respect for others, warning us through the history of the lost continent about technological advances and their irresponsible manipulation. So what happened to the powerful crystals that the Atlanteans used? Did they take them? Did they leave them behind? And if so, where are the crystals? According to Casey and the dialogues of Plato, Timaeus and Chrysias, Atlantis quickly disappeared. If so, perhaps they didn't have time to transport the crystals, which we imagine were gigantic and difficult to transport. In the face of disaster of dimensions, we believe that it's possible that saving life and possessions was easier and a priority, leaving behind the buildings and those crystals. If so, they should be under the sea somewhere. So if Atlantis was located in the middle of the ocean rather than to the north, in front of the current Canary Islands to the east and the Sargasso Sea to the west, is that the place where a sunken mountain range could well be the vestiges of the lost continent? If so, the crystals would be in that mountain range, waiting for someone who can use them correctly. Casey never said where the crystals were, although we believe the data might be in the Akashic records. A brilliant mind like that of Casey could enter the library of Akashic records and get good information about everything, but kept it to himself, information that at that time the world couldn't handle, and we're perhaps still not ready to handle it. Imagine a current world with wars, hunger, unemployment and so on, but with a group handling the crystals. Imminent disaster. If this is what we think is true, then it's sure that there could be a better world, one that Casey saw and that he counted, and that we're sure will have another sleeping prophet that will place the missing pictures of the puzzle.
According to the Timaeus and Chrysias of Plato, 435 BC, 10,000 years ago, there was a majestic continent island larger than Libya and Asia combined that birthed a mighty people with wonders and technologies bestowed on them by Poseidon himself. They were the mighty Atlanteans, who conquered and enslaved the proto-tribes of Northern Europe, North Africa, Egypt and Greece. However, in 9445 BC, the tribes of Athens led an international resistance force against the Atlantean Empire. The alliance won, forcing the Atlanteans to retreat past the Pillars of Hercules, only to fall to natural disasters and sink to the bottom of Poseidon's ocean in a single day. Whether it is true or not, according to John Eckel, all that would remain would be the Atlantis ring of Luxor, left behind in Egypt by an evacuating Atlantean priest, that would then disappear into the abstractions of history. The enslaved people of Europe, Africa, Egypt and Greece were free once more, only to watch as their alliance dissolved as fast as their Atlantean oppressors. With the demise of this ancient international alliance, so the historical memories of the past were lost. All that would remain were fragments of stories told to Socrates and finally Plato. For the next few thousand years after Plato, scholars would argue whether Atlantis ever existed until 1860, when the French Egyptologist Marcos de Egrin discovered the ring during an excavation in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. According to the radiesthesist André de Belizal in 1922, the Atlantis ring was gifted to the archaeologist Howard Carter as an amulet protecting him from the evil curse of Tutankhamun's tomb, a curse that allegedly took the life of his partner, Lord Carnarvon, and 18 other people in 2 years after the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb. After Carter's death in 1939, it finally appeared in possession of Belizal to be further explored for its mystical abilities in the 1970s. Belizal has spent close to 30 years deciphering its mysteries, whether they indeed harken back to the days of colonial Atlantis, or whether they are nothing more than the trinkets from a Cairo market. Atlantis rings have carried significant intrigue throughout the last 50 years since the first discovery. After all, its discovery does coincidentally happen during the New Age movement of the 1950s and 60s, and therefore there are suspicions of its authenticity. Though some accounts have mentioned that its first discovery occurred in Egypt in 1860, the plethora of stories regarding the Atlantean ring and bar originate in France in the 1900s, and are forgotten until the 1960s when the New Age movement revived its popularity. As mentioned before, according to Belazal, the original Atlantis ring was found in 1860 in the Valley of the Kings by Marcus Deogarin during an excavation, and it was initially known as the Ring of Luxor. It later gained the name Atlantean Ring sometime in the mid-1960s. The ring was reported to be over 5,000 years old, and it was made of dark sandstone from the mines of Aswan. It was adorned with geometric symbols, placed following a specific arrangement. It appeared unlike any style indicative of Egyptian culture. Its patterns were simplistic, as claimed by Ackel. It seemed to be modern and timeless, with the simplicity of lines and shapes. 3 parallel semi-cylindrical stripes resembling rectangles ran along the middle of the length of the ring's band. The 2 holes existed at the points of 2 isosceles triangles. Its design follows specific measurement associated with sacred geometry proportions of the golden mean. Because of this, the Atlantis ring is said to help in protection and healing, and intuition of whoever wears it. Dr. Belazal was a practitioner of radiesthesia, the study of vibrational fields within the human body, which allowed the access of information from animate or inanimate objects. In the mid-1960s, de Belazal conducted vibration tests on the ring, using specific calibrated instruments to decode the resonant energy vibration from the Atlantis ring. De Belazal's results discovered that the ring's geometric shapes created a faint energy force field consisting of minute energy vibrations. This effectiveness corresponded to the correct placement and alignment of the Luxor symbol. The ring's electromagnetic waves prevented the alteration of the energy signature. This energy acted as a force field to whoever wore it. It allegedly was able to increase an individual's ability to access their subconscious mind. With his findings, de Belazal keyed the term waveform of Luxor, which had to do with the studying of the geometry of the ring. He then proceeded to create a larger and flatter version known as the harmonizer of Luxor, in order to see if similar principles could be used to protect more massive places, such as a home or office. In de Belazal's book, Microvibratory Physics and Invisible Forces, he details the construction of the wave of Luxor, or what was better known as the Atlantis bar. He discovered that when the shapes were flattened, the contraption was able to maintain properties for compensation and balance of the cosmic telluric energies in a consistent area. According to de Belazal, the Atlantis bar needed to be orientated with a magnetic north-south axis. To rotate the bar's energy, one would require a pendulum to calibrate for the best energy flow. De Belazal also alleged that the Atlantis ring and bar were based on the authentic waveforms found in Egyptian sarcophagi to create a protection zone to shield against the rupture from cosmotelluric forces or negative energies brought forth from men holding bad intentions. Another alternative scientist, which de Belazal based his research on, was Dr. Ibrahim Karim, and his holistic approach of uniting ancient Egyptian energy science, physical radiesthesia, and the modern technology to create pendulums and devices able to work with both new and old technologies. Karim's approach, called biochemistry, was based on 3 essential qualities that are in resonance with one harmonizing subtle energy quality. The horizontal negative green, higher harmonic of ultraviolet, and higher harmonic of gold. According to his theories, any form of pyramid and planes were energy emitters that focused on a piercing energy wave he termed negative green. Carmen believed that the energy wave had 2 property settings of horizontal and vertical. The horizontal negative green was beneficial for living systems, while the vertical negative green merely preserved things from decay. In Karim's discussions, he believed that the Atlantis ring was made with the precision for the emission of beneficial energies which resonated in the biogeometry 3. However, even though de Belazal and Dr. Karim attempted various holistic scientific approaches, most people in the scientific community dismissed their methods as pseudoscience due to the vagueness of their methods, analysis, and conclusions. The question that should be asked is not how they reached their findings, but where the influence of their beliefs came from. Thus, to understand why such tests appeal to believers of the New Age movement, one would need to understand the times in which it took place. Though de Bellezel's methods seem unconventional, he was experimenting with techniques that were quite intriguing for those who partook in the New Age movement during the 1960s and 70s. This was a time when growing interest in the revival of various spiritual beliefs was at an all-time high. Though some would argue that the New Age movement began in the early 1930s and 1940s, it was strongest during the mid-1960s until the 1990s. The New Agers drew heavily from several older esoteric traditions, specifically from the occultist influences of the 18th century. A lot of these older occult beliefs and re-emergence of older faiths from antiquity became retrofitted with several mid-20th century influences, primarily in the technological sciences. The counterculture of the 1960s also influenced the New Age's development in the openness to otherworldly perspectives. There were a number of mid-20th century influences, including the work of 16th century theologian and spiritualist Emanuel Swedenborg, as well as the 18th century Dr. Franz Mesmer, who theorized the existence of natural energy transference between animate and inanimate objects. However, one of the most popular modern people to fuel the fire of the 20th century New Age movement was the sleeping prophet known as Edgar Cayce. Through his prominence in the 30s and 40s, his prophecies and mystical abilities to dictate potential cures to ailments and his legacy have lived on well into the 1980s. Cayce delivered over 14,000 individual predictions over 3 distinct periods between 1877 and his death in 1945. He gave predictions regarding political events, natural disasters, celebrity deaths, and discoveries of all sorts. However, his most intriguing predictions were of people's past lives from the lost continent of Atlantis. During his clairvoyant readings of the Akashic records, he gave his version of the legend of Atlantis, those who reincarnated from the different time periods of Atlantis, a detailed account of Atlantis before and after 50,000 BC, and its final destruction due to the war between the sons of Belial and the children of the Laws of One. He spoke of the aftermath that came. In some of his accounts he mentioned priests who used energy crystals and brought laws and religion to Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Americas after it fell, spreading variations of the original stories of Atlantis. In Cayce's readings, he frequently spoke of various energy crystals, most often offering recommendations on which crystals to use for whichever ailment affected the sufferer. Like many other faiths, during the New Age movement, energy fields from gems and objects were quite prominent. If one were to believe the works of Edgar Cayce as real visions of the past, could there be some connections to the works of de Bellezel and Dr. Carman in their scientific tests of the Atlantis ring? Or could they both be resonating their beliefs from the emerging New Age movement? During the New Age movement, healing crystals gained an upsurge in popularity as an alternative treatment to modern Western medical science. Practitioners who use healing crystals believe that they act as conduits for healing and allow positive healing energy to flow into the body as negative disease-causing energy flows out. The philosophies of modern crystal healing are based on the traditional concepts borrowed from several other cultures, ranging from the ancient Sumerians of Mesopotamia and the concepts of magical protection, the ancient Egyptians in the notion of the preservation of the soul, the Chinese culture in the belief of life energy, qi, and the Hindu or Buddhist conceptions of the chakra, which mention vortices of life energy said to connect the physical and supernatural elements of the body. Other cultural beliefs from Native Americans, such as the Hopi, have also been borrowed in the explanation of energy crystals and their healing powers. Though most scientists believe there is no valid evidence for healing crystals in the curing of diseases, or that there have been any crystals or gems which can be differentiated by chemical composition or color in relation to specific ailments, healing crystals remain popular in health spas and New Age health clinics today. In the English-speaking world, healing crystals became heavily associated with the New Age spiritual movement due to the multiple cultural and ancient religious fusions to the crystals, uses as well as the promotion of extreme personalization and creative expression it allegedly offered. Like de Bellezel's research into radiesthesis, the intrigue of energy waves and pulses emitted good and evil force fields resonated by the spiritual New Age movement, because it could only be adjusted to fit whatever narrative the individuals desired. In a sense, the New Age movement allowed for the freedom of expression and interpretation of the unknown, where most felt science couldn't provide answers. With an urge for many New Agers to link the new and old world together, there was a push to discover whether the old interpretations would parallel any forms of modern technology. Whether one believes in the fall of Atlantis, the testaments of the prophets, or the crystals of the New Age movement, what is indeed offered by André de Bezel's Atlantis Ring and Bar is a playful exploration into the belief of positive vibes and energy force fields. Though modern science will never recognize these methods as mainstream due to their strong correlation with the New Age movement, it opens thought to the potential abilities and beliefs of the ancient world, no matter how skewed or opinionated it may be. After all, even in mainstream science, there is a movement for more holistic and heuristic approaches between the biological and social, thanks to the examination of epigenetics, which reveals that both social and environmental factors are responsible for the changes in genes and inevitably evolution. Could the energy waves which the New Age scientists explore be associated with this? Not so much in today's world, but if one believes in the prophecies of the New Age mystics, perhaps tomorrow.
A mysterious carved pyramid, hidden, has been discovered amid the thick trees and bushes on the slopes of Mount Kazagi in north-central Japan. Local folk belief connects the structure with a giant white snake that is said to reside within it. Some researchers believe this strange pyramid and other unexplained ancient remains at Atami, southwest of Tokyo, are surviving testimony to an Atlantean civilization who traveled over the Earth in the remote past. Atlantis. The magical lost land of Atlantis has captured the imagination of poets, scholars, archaeologists, geologists, occultists, and travelers for more than 2,000 years. The notion of a highly civilized advanced island civilization, which flourished in remote antiquity only to be destroyed overnight by a huge natural catastrophe, has inspired believers in the historical truth of the Atlantis tale to search practically every corner of the Earth for remnants of this once great civilization. Most archaeologists are of the opinion that the Atlantis story is just that, a story, an allegorical tale with no historical value whatsoever. And then there are the occultists, many of whom have approached the story of Atlantis from the standpoint that it represents either a lost spiritual homeland, like Mu, Lemuria, or a different plane of existence entirely. The original source from which all information about Atlantis ultimately derives is Greek philosopher Plato, in his two short dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written somewhere between 359 and 347 BC. Plato's supposed source for the story of Atlantis was a distant relative of his, a famous Athenian lawmaker and lyric poet called Solon. Solon had in turn heard the story on a visit to the court of Amasis, king of Egypt from 569 to 525 BC, in the city of Sais on the western edge of the Nile Delta. While at the court of Amasis, Solon visited the temple of Neith and fell into conversation with priests who related the story of Atlantis to him. The priest described a great island, larger than Libya and Asia combined, that had existed 9,000 years before their time beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Straits of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantis was ruled over by an alliance of kings descended from Poseidon, god of the sea and earthquakes, whose eldest son, Atlas, gave his name to the island and the surrounding ocean. The Atlanteans possessed an empire that stretched from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean as far as Egypt in the south and Italy in the north. During an attempt to extend their empire further into the Mediterranean, the Atlanteans came up against the combined powers of Europe led by Athens, in this remote period already a great city and a society ruled by a warrior elite who disdained riches and lived a Spartan lifestyle. The armies of Atlantis were eventually defeated by the Athenians alone after their allies had deserted them. However, soon after the victory, there was a devastating earthquake followed by huge floods, and the continent of Atlantis sank beneath the ocean in a single dreadful day and night, in the words of Plato. Explorers have been searching for a real Atlantis for hundreds of years. A couple of recent discoveries have persuaded some researchers that the remains of the great civilization lie not in the Mediterranean, as one might reasonably suppose, but thousands of miles further east in Japan. Japanese pyramids. Mount Kasagi is a 1,950-foot-high mountain located in Kasagi town, in the southeastern part of the Kyoto prefecture. Their area is fairly remote, but is known for its Buddhist temple known as Kasagi-dera Temple, which has a large image of the Buddha carved into the surface of a rock. Less known is an apparent pyramid in the foothills at the site. There isn't a lot of information available on the fairly small structure, but it has apparently been constructed from a single massive piece of granite, weighing approximately 9 tons. There are no markings anywhere on the pyramid or any indication as to who, if it is not merely a natural rock, fabricated it. One or two researchers have linked the structure with the pyramids of ancient Atlantis, believing it may be a relic left by Atlanteans who visited the area many thousands of years ago. There are no similar stones to be found anywhere around it, though there are reports of 4 other similar stone structures spaced 330 feet apart on the ridge of Mount Kasagi, 3 of them forming a triangular shape. One interesting fact concerning these pyramid-like stones is that the area is extremely rich in prehistoric rock art, which may indicate that it was seen as sacred in antiquity and was visited by some kind of ancient priesthood to perform rituals, possibly handed down from Atlantean refugees, were performed at the pyramid as well. In an ancient ritual annually performed at the site, an offering of eggs is left at the pyramid for the serpentine spirit of the place, a sacred snake said to dwell at the site. Myths concerning sacred snakes and offerings of eggs are unknown elsewhere in Japan, or indeed Asia. But there are similar myths from Egypt concerning the eternal serpent called Neph or Onuphis, On meaning sun, Ophis meaning serpent. Kneph was frequently depicted as a serpent thrusting an egg from its mouth, while Ra himself was often worshipped as the egg within the serpent's coil. Some researchers have equated the serpent powers of Neph with the Benten, the Japanese Buddhist goddess of Mount Kasagi. The myth of Bentlen calls her the Lady of the White Serpents and describes her arrival in Japan after traveling across East Asia sometime around 1300 years ago. Her shrine in Shirahama, located deep in the rock caves of Sandabeki, is associated with water and the unconscious. A further connection to ancient Egypt is suggested by some researchers in the similarity between the name Benten and the Egyptian Benben, an Egyptian bird of immortality, akin to a phoenix. Interestingly, in ancient Egypt, the Benben stone is an object found in the mythology of the country. This fabled stone is said to have once been kept in a shrine within the compounds of the temple dedicated to the deity Atum in Heliopolis. Coincidentally or not, when considering the Japanese pyramid connection, the Benben stone is also an architectural term given to the tip of an obelisk or the capstone placed on top of a pyramid. Atami Atlantis. Whilst there have been no more of these miniature Atlantean-type pyramids found so far in Japan, there are other connections with ancient Atlantis. One of them can be found in the area of the city of Atami, at the northeastern base of the Izu Peninsula, less than an hour west of Tokyo. The city actually occupies the crater of the extinct volcano Mount Atami. The surrounding hills are the remains of the crater wall, which has been drowned by the sea to the east. Atami's mild and warm climate, scenic seascape, and hot springs have made it a favored resort since the 5th century AD. Noting its position inside an extinct volcano almost half beneath the sea, and the name Atami, some researchers believe that the city may have had a connection with Atlantis in prehistoric times. However, although some writers have claimed that the word Atami has no meaning in the Japanese language, it in fact means hot ocean, a reference to the town's famous onsen hot springs. One or two have even posited that an ancient volcanic eruption of Mount Atami and the destruction of a prehistoric city on the site may have in fact been the origin of the Atlantis story. They posit that refugees from the fabled land were forced to leave Atami and relocate elsewhere in Japan, probably to the coast of the Japanese island of Yonaguni, where there are a series of mysterious rock formations which some believe to be the remains of Atlantean structures. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura believes the ruins of a city off the coast of Yonaguni Island on the southwestern tip of Japan could even be the lost land of Atlantis, or even Mu, a Pacific equivalent of the tale of the lost city of Atlantis. Kimura, a professor at Ryukyu University and the chairman of the non-profit Marine Science and Culture Heritage Research Association, said, "Judging by the design and the disposition of the ruins, the city must have looked just like an ancient Roman city. I can envisage a triumphal arch-like statue stood on the left of the Colosseum and a shrine over the hill." Kimura believes the submerged city had a castle, a shrine, an arch, statues, and a Colosseum. He said, "In my estimation, the castle was situated right in the middle of the city, and though not as big as the castle and a lot of ruins, Kimura believes the city was sunk in an earthquake 3,000 years ago." Perhaps unsurprisingly, many scientists dismiss this claim, saying the ruins can be explained by natural phenomena such as tidal or volcanic activity. Perhaps the most significant objection to Kimura's theory, however, is that no ancient artifacts such as clay pots or weapons have ever been found in the vicinity of the rock formation to prove that humans had once been present there. Kimura, however, remains positive and determined to prove his theory, saying, "I'm getting close to a conviction that this is a mysterious civilization lost in a tectonic deformation in the Pacific Ocean." Atlantis, the beginning of everything. "Oh Atlantis, how much has been written in your name and how much more will be written until you show your beautiful face." Yes, the research we've done for a long time transited basically three places: ancient astronauts, UFOs, and Atlantis. We have a lot of information about everything, and mainly, we've come to the conclusion that everything is one thing. Our own theory above all, though, is the beginning of everything. Why a continent island that nobody knows ever existed, we strongly believe in its existence, has generated hundreds of books, movies, series, and other things. Simply, we think that she is the mother of all mysteries. It's a mystery so romantic, so great and epic, that many are amazed just to hear the story. We are among those who not only marveled, but also began to investigate this. The Priest of Size of Egypt says that there existed 9,000 years before its time, that is about 12,000 years ago, an island continent of a larger size than Libya, north of Africa, and Asia, last Asia, together, called Atlantis. This was a thriving, technologically advanced nation where science was the most important thing. Great philosophers, mathematicians, and experts in other sciences taught those who came to its shores. In addition, Atlantis was a military power which came to conquer the western part of Europe and, according to researchers, reached the eastern shores of America, where they have taught Americans astronomy, mathematics, and other sciences. In America, we have hundreds of stories of foreigners arriving from the East who taught the sciences to Aztecs, Mayans, and so on. The ancient inhabitants of America described foreigners as tall, white men with blonde beards. It was also rich in resources, metals, mainly highlighting the orichalco, a metal much more valuable to Atlanteans than gold. In such abundance, the Atlanteans wanted to conquer lands, and their advance was slowed down by the Athenians, so their influence on the west coast of Europe would only be seen. The main city of the island had a circular shape with several concentric circles. A circle was followed by a canal, which was followed by a circle of land, and so on, up to 5 circles of land, where the central circle was the nerve center of the island, where the parliament and religious center of the islands was located. The center of power of the Atlanteans was based on crystals, which generated energy and kept the Atlantean nation alive. But something happened. a cataclysm of gigantic dimensions that sank the island in a day and a night. The way in which Atlantis disappeared has also generated different theories. One of them says that a mega-earthquake hit the island, sinking it. Remains of this sinking would be the Canary Islands and a certain part of the Azores Islands. Even in the Sea of Sargasso would be vestiges of the forests of Atlantis. Another theory says tsunami, but it is the least credible story, since a tsunami brings water, but eventually the water goes away. The island disappeared directly. Also, one theory says that the disappearance of the island occurred because of the crystals of Atlantean power, and that some remnants of that power are still underwater in the Triangle of Bermuda, which is responsible for the disappearance of ships and planes. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, in one of his readings said that Poseidia, as he called Atlantis, will reappear very soon, not beyond 1968. And you know what? In 1968, in the area of the Bimini Islands, a series of platforms appeared called Camino de Bimini. These roads are actually walls, platforms, passages, and so on, several kilometers long. From the air, it's very similar to large avenues, squares, and possibly, if this were on the surface of the sea, it would be part of Atlantis, surely. That would give us the pattern of where Atlantis would be. But, according to more recent research, Atlantis could be the island of Santorini in Greece. The island was formed by a volcanic eruption and is circular with a small central island. This and other evidence, such as being in a place where traffic between Europe and Asia was constant, giving Santorini a privileged position in the Mediterranean, or the fact that it was a center where the arts and sciences predominated, would give the thought that the island would be confused with Atlantis. But all the given locations would not correspond, since none is beyond the columns of Hercules. So let's discard Santorini then. Much is written about Atlantis, although the reality is that not much has been written. How is this? If we refer only to the trustworthy sources, God the Word's limit, very old of Plato, disciple of Socrates, in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, where he speaks of the continent island that is found beyond the columns of Hercules, the Rock of Gibraltar. Plato says that he got the information from the priests of Sais in Egypt, which means that somewhere in Egypt we would find first-hand information about the location of Atlantis. For now, and beyond the dialogues, the rest is something of speculation, some research and some imagination. As for its location, it's more likely that it was located in the center of the Atlantic, and several old maps attest to that. There is a fact when reading the dialogues that we shouldn't overlook it. Plato, in his dialogue, tells us that the priest Sontius said the island was bigger than Libya and Asia together, and it was on the way to other islands, and from those you would cross the rest of the continent on the other side, the one that surrounded a true ocean. The sea is within the Straits of Hercules, the Mediterranean, and no more than a bay with a narrow entrance, but the other is a true sea, and the earth that surrounds it can be called a continent without limits. Now on this island of Atlantis there was a great and wonderful empire that dominated the whole island and several others, and parts of the continent and beyond. In addition, the men of Atlantis had conquered the part of Libya within the Pillars of Hercules, to Egypt, and to Europe, to Tyrrhenia in Italy. That is, Sontius clarifies that he speaks of the Atlantic Ocean, differentiating it from the Mediterranean Sea, and gives it one more fact. If we continue on the islands, Atlantis and others from the ocean, from these you could cross to the rest of the continent on the other side, that is, America. So for this article, Atlantis was located there in the middle of the Atlantic. We are persuaded that Atlantis existed, that it was a great empire where science and the arts prevailed, where military forces were powerful, and where there was an abundance of resources. This made the nation grow exponentially for a long time, making it a world power. But two events occurred that marked the beginning of the end. The Athenians slowed down the advance of the Atlanteans, and a cataclysm was the nail that closed the coffins of Atlantis, so to speak. In this short story, there is data that we have to consider. How is it possible that an island about 9 kilometers in diameter, according to Plato, the island had about 2,000 stadiums, disappeared in a day and a night? How is it possible that no traces remain beyond certain walls in the ocean that we assume are part of Atlantis? Where were the Atlanteans? If we assume that they were technologically advanced, they should have some escape plan. After many years of studying the dialogues and certain books such as The Mystery of Atlantis by Charles Berlitz, researchers soon realized that they did not like the conclusion. Imagine a civilization so advanced that it decides to enter the cosmos. Then, instead of spending millions of whatever currency they used on their planet, they decide to plan something more useful. They chose an asteroid of the desired dimensions, 35 kilometers in length, and then construct nozzles, engines, antennas, reflectors, solar panels, and so on, and turn the asteroid into a giant spacefaring ship. Today, researchers refer to this as Oumuamua, yet rarely enter into discussion about this strange asteroid. All these technological advances are strategically placed throughout the rock, which when chosen among several candidates. Besides the size, it would have to be made of iron. Almost pure 95 to 98% would be ideal. Not having sharp edges or peaks, in their case the smoother the better, and turning or rotating as little as possible. It would seem rather cigar-shaped, elongated. The asteroid would be decorated with devices except for its belly, where there is a single disc, smooth and polished, about 9 kilometers in diameter. Presumably, the aliens sent probes to the ends of the universe, choosing carefully according to the data collected by many probes. So they began their journey here. Many years, maybe thousands, they would travel the stars. Such an advanced culture would know how to cryogenize bodies, use robots to perform tasks as they sleep, until they eventually arrive at Earth. They strategically place themselves in a geostationary orbit close to Earth's atmosphere, and there the 9-kilometer disk came into action. It's a gigantic ship formed by a species who construct mechanisms that consist of concentric circles with a raised center, where the main power source, the general command cabin, and so on is located. The ship travels through Earth's atmosphere and settles on a series of islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Over the years, the ship is covered with earth, trees and grass, giving it the appearance of an island. These alien astronauts are dedicated to gathering information from around the globe, taking samples, learning from different cultures, and teaching them the science, art and technology. As time passes, they would become accustomed. They camouflage themselves among the natives, becoming part of the landscape. They began to conquer lands, and near and far. Their conquests were aided by advanced technology, the extraction of metals, the manufacture of orichalco, and even monatomic gold would provide them the tools to become the most advanced race on the planet. But eventually things would get ugly. The military power of the alien visitors declined for unknown reasons, and they began to lose ground to the Athenians, who were much better prepared militarily. Added to this is the fact that a significant earthquake was going to occur, a mega-earthquake very close to the place where their ship was located. After much thought, they made the decision to leave the planet. They fired their engines to the huge craft only minutes before the earthquake. The ship rises slowly and climbs, leaving Earth behind. They couple with a massive asteroid in orbit and head away to an unknown destination. The ship was called Atlantis, and the crew were the Atlanteans. This would be the reason why there are almost no vestiges of any advanced civilization. They fled back to where they once came, the heavens, taking the secrets of advanced technology with them, hoping to one day return to Earth and share their vast knowledge.